Hello, I'm Peter Friedman, CEO of LiveWorld, and this is Faces of Pharma. Today, we're speaking with Bob Libbey, a marketing veteran of the pharma industry. Hi, Bob. How are you doing today?
Great, Peter. Great to be with you, and often nice to see you.
Now, you and I know each other for a long time, but let's start with telling our viewers who you really are. And we'll start with, what have you been doing in the pharma industry, say, in the last 10 years?
Sure. Over the last 10 or just a little more years, Peter, I've worked at Pfizer, leading executive, colleague, and digital and social communications functions. Then I went to BMS for 4+ years, where I served as Vice President of Corporate Content and Channels. And currently, in fact, just very recently, I've joined the global biotech BeiGene as the Executive Director of Colleague Leadership in Digital Communications.
Well, that's actually pretty impressive, which brings us to the current world and the pandemic and so on. What would you say are the key challenges that pharma has had to face given the pandemic?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges, Peter, is the lack of face-to-face communications as a result of the pandemic, and so many working from home, except for those folks who are critical on-site employees.
So the biggest change sounds like not necessarily a function of the subject matter of the industry, but the day-to-day behavior and organizational interactions.
Well, I think it's both, really. But in terms of content for the industry as a whole, I think there's been a solid uptick in terms of the reception publicly to communications coming from pharma and biotech companies now, thanks almost entirely to the success of the COVID vaccines.
How do you see the whole industry changing because of the pandemic and the vaccines?
I think there's a greater appreciation overall for this work and the people who do it, the enormous power of science, the incredible importance of addressing conditions and situations like the pandemic.
Coming back to you, what would you say are your core strengths as a communications expert?
My core strength is my writing and editing skills. I started my career as a daily newspaper reporter working for the Gannett chain. I really loved that work. I loved working on deadline. Also, my ability to integrate subjects and formats and extend the value of content. To create good content, you need great people and you need time. There aren't that many people who are really good at this. There are a lot of people who do it, but to be really good and to be able to compete with everything that's out there on the internet is a big challenge, and there's never enough time. So my thought has been and continues to be that when you have a great piece of content, you want to get as much mileage out of it as you can.
This is really interesting because we have the internet and social media and everything, and it's mostly words. I mean, there's a lot of video and a lot of photos, but when you really look at it, the amount of words, whether it's just text or it's with photos or with videos, dwarfs everything else. So there's more and more of it.
I like to say that the internet's one big sheet of content ice. There are no stalls, there are no boundaries. When you think about how you and I use the internet, just skating essentially from one task to another, from our emails to checking our social accounts, posting about your new puppy. When you create content, you're not just competing with other pharma or biotechs. You're competing with everything that's out there. At the same time, attention spans are getting shorter. They're down to about 3 seconds. So it's a huge challenge. You need great content creators. I've taught writing at the graduate level, business writing, PR writing, and you realize so many people haven't been taught to write properly. And so they come into jobs with skills that are often uneven and no time to train them. And I think that's something that my profession has to face and reckon with.
All right then. Bob Libbey, writer, editor, journalist, teacher. Here you are working at a newspaper. Somewhere between then and now, you took a career turn into pharma. What inspired you or made you to do that?
I left the newspaper business and went and worked at a small agency, PR agency in New York. I was intrigued by the challenge of not only having to tell a story, but to tell it in a way that would change people's minds, make a point, move them to action, whatever the case might be. But when the opportunity came to work in pharma biotech, I jumped at it, because it's an enormous amount of time and money that goes into discovering and developing medicines. And it was clear that there was a lot of room to better tell the story.
How did it differ from what you thought it would be to what it turned out to be?
It's much more dynamic than I thought it would be. What happens behind the scenes, and in some ways this is no different than any other industry I've worked in, it's only more intense. And the stakes are so high, and there's a lot happening every day. So I would say that's the biggest difference between the reality and what I expected.
Well, Bob, it sounds like you've been a high velocity reporter all your life. And at first it was like news that a newspaper would do. And then in later years, it's kind of a constant stream of the information and news around the companies that you've worked for in pharma, and how do you effectively enable these companies to report on what they're doing and people to understand it.
What I'm always looking for, Peter, is how do you do this better? What haven't we seen yet? One thing I've been working on is finding ways to tell our stories in a more integrated way, recognizing that the old segmentation of audiences is being erased, if you will, by technology. So there's no longer a truly external only and internal only audience. I think it starts with the story and really ends with the story, and the rest of it in between are means to an end.
If you were going to give advice to the other industry veterans and industry leaders today, what would that be?
Yeah, it would be to focus on the quality of your content. Look at how you can extend your true quality content to better tell your story. I think we're all moving so fast, handling such high volumes. There's a limit to what people can absorb.
And there you have it. Bob Libbey, the writer who became a reporter and an editor, a journalist, who saw the challenge in the pharma industry between what it really is all about and what people think, took on that, has become a communications veteran, and when you get right down to it, it's all about the story. Thanks, Bob, for joining us and telling us your story.
Thank you, Peter. I appreciate it.